really looking forward to listening to Prof Puleng from UNISA. She will be talking to us about the use of embroidery in research and how we can decolonize research methodology. So a very warm welcome and thank you to Prof Puleng for being with us today. So I will be sharing my screen. Okay, can everybody see?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let's do that again. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes,
so,
perfect.
Prof, you may go ahead.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for making the time to come and be part of this conversation. I'm going to be talking about visual research methodologies more broadly and using one of the research projects that I have been involved in for a while now on embroidery and looking at embroidery as a decolonizing method. I would like to thank Fatima and the organizing team for making this webinar possible today, and I hope that you will find the session fruitful. Next slide, please, Fatima. Okay, so I would like to start my talk by drawing from two examples. And the first one being that growing up as a child in the townships here in South Africa, we used to play various games in the streets. These included hand games, childhood chants, and various other games. And in places like the United States, such games have been written about and theorized. One such theorization is called kinetic orality. Kinetic orality is a term which was coined by Cornel West way back in 1989 in his essay called Black Culture and Postmodernism. It is an African-American musical genre that combines body movement with voice. This includes foot stomping, hand clapping, and percussive singing to accentuate the body as essentially a musical instrument. It only relies on the body to produce sounds and music. According to an ethnomusicologist, Kyra Gant, kinetic orality assists Black girls to learn relatedness through these various games, and also as they play, gender is embodied through song and movement. Furthermore, kinetic orality is also perceived as a way of performing race. The Black girls perform their Blackness through these games that they play within their various neighborhoods. According to Gant, the body is the holder of memory and community as well. Reading and learning about kinetic orality allowed me to reflect back to my own childhood and think about the ways in which I related with other young girls when I played these games as well. And to realize how these were linked to processes of belonging and community as young girls playing together and engaging with one another, relating with one another. So through these processes, then there's also a process of or a sense of belonging to a community, a sense of belonging to a group as well. And it also afforded shared experiences and relatedness. We mirrored each other and connected at various levels through the games that we played. And then the second example that I would like to refer to, next slide, please. Next slide, Fatima. The second slide the second example that I would like to refer to is linked to what happened in Rwanda. As many of us might know, that in 1994, Rwanda experienced one of the most brutal genocides in the continent. It deeply affected the Rwandese people who had to rebuild a nation following the genocide. People sought ways to deal with the resulting trauma so that they can move on with life. There was a need for the process of reconciliation, forgiveness, accountability, and healing following the genocide that happened. The country had to find a way to ensure that healing process takes place. 10 years following this genocide, an intergenerational group of Rwandese women came together to form a drumming group, an intergenerational drumming group called Ingoma Neasha. So this Ngoma Nshaya it means new power. And the group consists of women from the Hutu and the Tutsi groups. This group of women drummers chose to flip the script and use drumming, which in Rwanda for a longest time has been an activity reserved for men, but these women used it as a mode of working towards reconciliation. And also nation building as well. They came together to invite communities to voice their pain and trauma in a way that was not reliant on traditional vocalizing of pain and loss. They used the collective drumming sessions to spread a message of hope and social cohesion. Ingoma Nshaya is an example of how women form webs and networks of care that offers hope and bring people together. So you'll see here in this picture, a group of women playing drums together. But who are these women? These women who form part of Ingoma Nshaya are the daughters of the perpetrators during the genocide. They are the daughters of the perpetrators, the widows, women whose husbands were killed in the conflict, wives of the perpetrators, and also orphans whose parents were killed in the conflict. One can imagine the possible complicated dynamics at play here. But the women decided that they would like to create a platform that made it possible to reimagine a reconciled Rwanda. And they did this and continue to do so through drumming and dancing. Drumming in Rwanda, in particular, is an activity that has always been reserved for men. The process of drumming plays the role of summoning, that is, calling upon or calling attention to. It is an embodied experience that allows the instrument, which is the drum, and the drummer to be one. In her work on trauma, Rogers interrogates the notion of the unspeakable and looks at how trauma becomes carried through in the body, rendering spoken language almost often insufficient in expressing deep-rooted experiences and emotions that people go through. She offers multiple and creative ways that people can communicate that which they cannot easily talk about. That is the unsayable. And according to Rogers, the invisible and the unsayable trauma marks itself in the body. And one of the ways to express it is through the symbolic form of art. So the Rwandan women of Ingoma Nshaya express and confront their trauma through drumming. I offer these two examples here as a backdrop to the discussion I would like to have with you today on decolonizing methodological approaches. Many of us have been trained and have read articles and books on various methodological approaches, and we have and continue to draw from these to tackle our own research endeavors. Decolonizing research methodologies requires us step outside of our comfort zones and reimagine other ways in which research could be conducted, especially within psychology. The decolonial scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos' notion of ecologies of knowledge becomes useful here. What de Sousa Santos does is that he urges us as scholars to embrace multiple forms of knowing, where meaning is negotiated and never fixed. De Sousa Santos also suggests that there is a need to situate knowledge beyond the geopolitical, that is the north-south or the south-south, but rather in the political economy of local meaning. So when we produce knowledge, from where are we producing this knowledge? Which context? What is our positionality? What is our situatedness in terms of how we make meaning of the world? What knowledges are embedded in our communities? This is the question that I would like us to think about. And what efforts do we make to take those knowledges seriously in our research endeavors? And if we were to make such efforts, what would centering knowledges nestled in our communities look like? It would mean looking at the games that young people play in our communities and ask, in what way could these games contribute or assist me as a researcher, as a student, as a scholar, to get an understanding of identity politics, of self-esteem construction, and of understanding the world as we know it? What are the dynamics at play that could assist me to make meaning of ways in which people relate to one another? Or we could ask, what assets do our communities have that could assist them to tackle the traumas that they have experienced? What is the familiar that I can draw from to answer the big questions that I have about human psychological well-being? I suggest that we should not be too reliant on the texts provided to us, but challenge ourselves to move beyond and be open to learn from the communities we are interested in learning more about or want to collaborate with. This requires humility, obviously. Next slide, please. In an essay that he published in 1972 entitled Society and Theory in Social Psychology, the French psychologist Serge Moscovici makes the following observation. The real advance made by American social psychology was not so much in its empirical methods or in its theory construction, as in the fact that it took for its theme of research and for the contents of its theories the issues of its own society. Its merit was as much in its techniques as in translating the problems of American society into psychological terms and in making them an object of scientific inquiry. So if we take the first example that I gave when I was talking about kinetic orality, what Cornell did was that he observed his own community, right? He looked within the Black American neighborhoods and looked at the different games that young girls or young children play, and used those to try and make meaning of how people relate to one another. How do young girls understand the idea and notion of race? How do they understand the idea of belonging and relatedness? And how do they experience the embodied knowledges that they have from their own communities? And we find this a lot also in many of our theories within psychology. For those who are doing social psychology, for example, you think of the many social psychology theories that we draw from in our teaching in our classroom, and you realize that as Moscovici says, most of these theories were developed within particular contexts. And as a result, they were looking at understanding or make meaning of a particular phenomena that was within a particular context. So when we import such knowledges without really critically looking at the applicability or looking at the context within or wherein we would like to apply these theories, it becomes a challenge because we might find that these theories are insufficient to assist us to make meaning and understand our own lived realities. And that is why it's important for us to think about the possibility of decolonizing knowledges, the possibility of decolonizing psychology, and in thinking about how we theorize, but also in thinking about the methods that we use in our research as well. Next slide, please. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, a Maori decolonial scholar, has done extensive work on the need to decolonize research methodologies. She argues that when Indigenous peoples become the researchers and not merely the researched, the activity of research becomes transformed. For Tuhiwai-Smith, decolonization is concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform the actual research practice. Method is important as it represents a set of conventions on how knowledge is gathered and codified. Tuhiwai-Smith goes on to argue that there are numerous oral stories which tell of what it means, what it feels like to be present while your history is erased before your own eyes, dismissed as irrelevant, ignored, or rendered as the lunatic ravings of drunken old people. And we know for the longest time, if we look at the history of how research was conducted amongst Indigenous people, there's always this pathologizing of people, this exoticizing of people, because often conclusions were reached without even the researched or the Indigenous people's voices being heard. So using a decolonial approach in this case would mean being committed to producing research knowledge that documents social injustice, that recovers subjugated knowledges, that helps create spaces for the voices of the silenced to be expressed and to be listened to, and also challenging racism, colonialism, and oppression. To this end, we have to consider alternative methods of conducting research. Next slide, please. So why is it important to consider alternative methodological approaches? And how can these alternative approaches be implemented? I shall attempt to answer these two questions by drawing from my own research work, which draws from visual research methodologies and embroidery work in particular. Next slide, please. When I was in primary school, we had to take needlework as part of our learning process. This was, of course, reserved for girls, as boys had to do gardening. It was at that early stage that I was introduced to needlework. But of course, the purpose of the skill was to prepare us as young girls for womanhood. So at the time, I did not imagine or think about the power that doing needlework held, and that depending on the kind of needlework one did, it could be transformed into a beautiful work of art, which I then later learned that this artistic aspect of needlework is something that could be useful for us to think about how we can produce knowledge through art forms. It was when watching my mother mixing colors on her lap and sewing on cloth that I started realizing the possibility that lies in the needlework. Next slide, please. In some parts of the world, such as the United States and even in South Africa, South America, etc., the making of embroidery work, quilting, and sewing in general have for a long time been reserved for and perceived as women's duties, as I've just alluded to. Sewing has long been perceived as a symbol of childhood and female bondage. It was intended to inculcate in little girls their class or gender virtues of neatness, submissiveness, docility, and patience. Sewing was also intended to prepare girls for conventional notions of womanhood. It was in the past reserved for women, used to keep them from active political participation. However, many women in places like the United States during slavery used their needlework skill for making political statements and expressing their life circumstances through the images as early as the mid-19th century. As you can see, some examples that you have there in the images that you have in the slideshow. In this way, there was a redefinition of the role that needlework played in women's lives in particular. More examples of women using needlework to speak back to power and to express their suffering can be found in countries such as Chile, Argentina, and Guatemala. So in Chile, for example, women used quilting to tell stories of the political issues that were happening in Chile, where people disappeared, where there was civil war and people were fighting within the country. And through thinking about some of the traumas of losing their loved ones, of having their loved ones disappear, many women came together to do needlework and to make quilts that tell the stories of the missing people, that tell the story of the history of the conflicts that happened in their country in Chile. And many of these quilts are found in national museums. So when people go to the museums, then they get a glimpse of some of the history and some of the stories and experiences of the women from the different communities within Chile. Embroidery as a form of needlework allows those participating in it narratives and tell stories from their own perspective. As a researcher using visual methodologies, I work with the assumption that increased participant control of data generation through production of visual images will help to illuminate important aspects of lived experiences of people that might otherwise have been overlooked or ignored by researchers, perhaps even remaining invisible as well. So it's important then to think about what are the alternative methodologies, what are the alternative ways in which we can tell the stories that allow for people's voices, especially those whose voices have been rendered invisible for a long time, to be audible as well. Next slide, please. Embroideries allow people to document their stories. It allows people to document their pain, their voices, those who have been voiceless for a long time, their struggles, their subjectivities, and the dreams that they have. And all of this happens from the perspective of the person making the embroidery. And embroideries refuse linearity. So things are not linear, stories are not linear. They keep changing, they are complex, and they also allow for transcendence or single voice or single voiceness, and they enable narratives typically silenced. Embroidery further allows space for the interweaving of people's life stories with history. So knowing that what people are experiencing today or people's lives are embedded also in their historical experiences as well. So the presence is always in relation to the past and also the anticipated future. It highlights the importance of acknowledging the interconnectedness between individual narratives and how their experiences cannot be separated from those of their families and their communities. So it allows us to move from individualization of people's experiences, that people's lives always happen in relation to other people, in relation to their communities as well. It forces us as researchers to analyze the complexities, contradictions, and multidimensional understandings of life experiences. Using visual images such as embroideries to tell people's stories enables people, in particular women, who survived horrific assaults against material, social, and cultural bodies to reclaim these and reconstitute discontinuous subjectivities and reposition themselves as human beings. And therefore, the power of the visual image is unlike other forms of communication, as it is universally comprehensible, right, and accessible as well. So when you look at an image as an individual, you can always try and interpret it in your own way and make meaning of what you see in front of you in your own way. And it can be used to facilitate discussion. So when people look at an embroidery, then they can have a conversation about what it is that they perceive in front of them. But it also allows some process of documenting experience. And something that can always be available later on as well. And it facilitates critical analysis of social reality and problem solving. Now, if you look at the embroidery that is in front of you, this is an example of one of the embroideries that were made by the women who I collaborate with in the research that I do. So this is one of the embroideries that the women did. And the idea here was to reflect back. So as women who grew up in South Africa, to reflect back and think about the challenges and complexities and struggles that they had to go through as young women growing up during apartheid South Africa. So during that conflict period, what are some of the ways or some of the things that they did to navigate and to survive the brutal, oppressive state of apartheid? And what were the ways in which they were affected, both individually but also as a collective within their family, the ways in which families were disintegrated, the ways in which people were denied education, the ways in which people were displaced. So with all of these experiences and memory and thinking back, then women could come up with embroideries that depict these complexities of what it meant to be a young girl growing up in South Africa, and thinking about that in relation to the current South Africa and making meaning of what it means to now live within a democratic South Africa. So this embroidery then aimed at embedding all these complex stories and complex experiences of women growing up within South Africa. And they did this through the visual image that allows the viewer or the person looking at the embroidery to make meaning of the embroidery from their own perspective as well. With embroidery, there is space to look beyond the perceived hopelessness and to imagine possibilities for resistance, for courage, and determination. Oftentimes when we look at people's lives, we're looking and we categorize people as hopeless, we categorize people as helpless, we categorize people as suffering, and therefore assuming that they do not have agency in terms of what's going on in their lives. But what these embroideries in the project that I was involved in allowed the women to do was to also lift and highlight the ways in which women resisted the oppressive apartheid state, the ways in which women had courage also to confront the inequalities that they were they had to confront within their lives. Furthermore, embroidery offers the opportunity to highlight structural violence and inequalities, as it was the case within apartheid, as an example. These inequalities that have had direct impact on people's everyday encounters. And what embroidery does, it enables what Louis Wise and Michelle Fine call critical bifocality. And what critical bifocality means, or what it does, is that it compels us as scholars and researchers to stand back and notice through the artwork the interweaving of history, of politics, and the role of various institutions in the making and unmaking of lives and communities. So we don't just look at life unidirectionally, but also understand the multifaceted and multidimensional understanding of people's lives. Embroidery offers us space, and it offers those who make embroideries space to embody the injustices and to create knowledge, produce and lay out their experiences onto a piece of cloth that can be multi-layered with stories of pain, of anger, of resilience, of resistance, of hope, of love, and of desire. And it also forces a rupture in the persistent miscarriage of justice. So people putting on the spotlight the many injustices that they were confronted with, but also the injustices that they still continue to be confronted with. By making embroideries, the participants move beyond and challenge the often imposed categories and labels, as I've indicated, of people being labeled as vulnerable or being perceived as the marginalized, right? And as the marginalized, they need to be spoken for and things have to be done for them, assuming that people do not have agency. So some of the things that I would like us to consider when working with embroideries is that when looking at the meaning of voice in visual images, it is important to acknowledge the co-construction of voice. So you coming in as the researcher or as the scholar, working together with community members and understanding that as the knowledge is produced within that space, that it is co-constructed. And Luttrell and Schafflin, in their work, they raise issues also pertaining to the complexities of images, the types of images presented, and whether images are meant to illustrate or complement the text produced within the research process. They further highlight the ethical implications also with regard to circulation of images. So when we've made embroideries, when you've done your research work and you've produced embroideries, what happens to those images? How do these images get circulated? And how do all of these things become negotiated between you and your collaborators within the research project? And these are very important things to also think about as well. It's a crucial issue that needs to be discussed and negotiated with the participants. These negotiated terrains should be acknowledged in our analysis and theorizing as well. When conducting research, a collaborative decision needs to be made and conversations need to be had about who will have ownership of the visual images, such as embroideries, when the work is completed. Do the images remain within the community or do the images then become part of the institution, the university, the researcher? And therefore, it becomes important to have these conversations as well. So in my particular research, we agreed together with my collaborators that the embroideries form part of knowledge producing and they can continue to be used for facilitation of learning, and therefore they can be used within the classroom as one of the ways in which we can think about research methodologies. And as a result, the embroideries are then with me at the university. But with the collaborators always having access to these embroideries. Furthermore, it is critical to ascertain whether the participants are willing to have their artwork exhibited as a way of sharing their expression of history and personal experiences. It is critical to interrogate and understand how we continuously produce inquiry that reproduces silences, that cover up ruptures and retell the dominant story, because those are the only discourses that are available. But using visual images allows us to actually move away from the dominant discourses, from the dominant theories, from the dominant methods, to actually think differently about how we can conduct our research. It is at this point where engaged methods such as embroidery and visual methods in general and the aesthetic open up opportunities to pierce what McClelland and Fine call the cellophane, that cushion dominant discourses, right? We hide behind theories, we hide behind methods, behind objectivity, and therefore we can then claim the universal truth. And what visual methodologies or engaged methods allow us to do is to pierce the cellophane and show how complex people's lives are. And as a result, we cannot just rely on the dominant methods that we have always used and feel comfortable and cushioned in as well. We need to contest epistemologies of ignorance that saturate popular culture and the discipline of psychology in particular. The narrative fabrics offer an opportunity to speak beyond the local, about the banal, the everyday, with one's own signature. Next slide, please. It may not always be clear for whom the pictures and embroideries have been created. Imagined audiences can change and play an important role in what is said or left unsaid, and interpretation is highly dependent on contextual features of the viewing situation. So who is the viewer at a particular moment, and what meaning do they derive from looking at a visual image? This may be perceived as a weakness or a strength, depending on how you look at it, of visual methods, and also depending on the intention of the researcher. Because embroideries lend themselves to possible multiple interpretations, for me, I feel it remains the viewer's choice on how the interpretation will be made. This flexibility in interpretation allows for complexity and highlights the complicated nature of people's lived experiences. Embroidery forces the viewer to ask questions about why certain colors were used, or why this particular story was told and not another story. Can the audience see their own story within the story that has been told? Is it something that they can relate to? And how do we both respect the positions that participants take when making embroideries and still analyze critically the ideologies and discourses through which the participants make these embroideries? It is critical to find a space where faith and suspicion cohabit, right? Having faith in people's stories and what they are telling us and what they are producing, but also critically looking at the work at the same time. What Ruth Ellen Josselson in her work on narratives called the hermeneutics of suspicion and hermeneutics of faith, right? So here, then, it allows for the multiple layers of truths to be acknowledged. And for me, I see visual methods offering us a compass towards this direction. And one of the last things that I would like to then move towards is also ethical consideration. As we know, within research, ethics are very important, and ethical processes being followed when we conduct research is something that we also need to think seriously about. When conducting research, we are bound by ethical codes which inform how we do our research. These codes serve a critical purpose, and there are set guidelines and principles which we have to follow when conducting our research. What I'd like to highlight, however, is that often these guidelines restrict, hinder, and limit what research can achieve. This is because the ethical guidelines are often one-dimensional, and the challenge is that we are almost forced to tick boxes before we even commence the work of conducting research. We promise anonymity, we promise confidentiality, and we make assurances that the research data will be locked away. I don't know why we do work if we're going to be locking it away afterwards. This is because most of these decisions are made before we even set foot in the community where we hope to conduct our research. So I ask, why can't we say, for example, anonymity will be negotiated. Sometimes people want to be known. Sometimes people want the reader to know that I am the one who shared this experience. And therefore, it should be something that should be negotiated and not a box that is ticked at the beginning of conducting research. And I mention this because in works like embroidery, where you're hoping that the work will be exhibited and shared with people, obviously I cannot take the embroideries and lock them away in a cabinet. Right. And the issue again of ethical, thinking about ethical issues within research is something that has really been a thorn in many communities, where community members feel that researchers come in, they take, they go, and they never come back. And for this reason, the San people of Southern Africa developed their own ethical code, which is called the San Code of Research Ethics. And they did this after feeling exploited and taken advantage of by numerous researchers who conducted research among them. As people who understand their context better and have knowledge of their own community, they drafted an ethics code that is in line with their worldview, and this had to be adhered to by all researchers intending to conduct research among and with the San people. And I think this is a step towards the right direction, that even when you come with your ethical clearance from the university, that the community itself must still have a say in terms of what ethical codes have to be followed if you're going to be doing research within the community. So what I learned from doing my work and from engaging with what it means to do our work decolonially is that there is definitely a rethinking needed in how we understand and define ethical codes. For example, the embroideries produced with my collaborators were chosen to be part of an exhibition collection arranged by the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Atrocities based in New York. And what that meant was that our embroidery work was exhibited at the Venice Biennale, which was in 2019. And the work formed part of a collection called Activism, which was exhibited there from May until November. And this slideshow that you see was at the opening of that exhibition. So the work was then there for 6 months. And my research collaborators, the women from the community that I worked with to make these embroideries, accompanied me to Venice for the official opening of the exhibition. So you see, for me, again, this is where issues of people remaining anonymous and us not knowing who the data came from becomes a problem in the type of research that I do. And that is why I really insisted that they become part of people going to Venice for this exhibition, because they're an integral part of the project that I did. The embroideries continue to have life, and the people that I worked with in the research remain part of the process. In addition to presenting about the work at conferences, which is what we do in academia, we also held a community dialogue where my collaborators, the community women, led the discussion and shared their experiences of some of the work depicted in these embroideries. We need to allow ourselves to think beyond what is in our textbooks, and we need to learn that what is within our academic corridors is not sufficient, but that there is knowledge that is embedded in our communities. From the knowledges embedded within these communities, for me, there lies the possibility to write new textbooks, to develop new theories, and to reimagine possible methods. And I would like to conclude with an extract from an opinion piece by Professor Stephen Friedman entitled "South Africa is Falling on COVID-19 because its leaders want to emulate the First World." Prof. Friedman makes an argument in this piece that the behaviors which are needed to stem COVID-19 are very difficult for most South Africans. And here he refers to those who live in the formerly Black-only urban townships and in shack settlements. He argues that overcrowding makes physical distancing very difficult. Clean water may not be available for hand washing, and people are forced to travel in full minibus taxis. The government could have overcome these problems if it had chosen to work with people in these areas to find ways to protect themselves. But it did not try. It relied on instructing people to do things they clearly could not do. To South Africa's elite, of which the government is now part, people in low-income township lack sophistication and maturity. Poverty, in this case, is confused with inability. And so there is no point in working with them. I highlight this example from Prof Friedman because it speaks to this idea of assuming that people do not understand their own lived realities. That when we're thinking about solutions to social ills, we impose things without negotiating and engaging and also coming to the table together with the people who are actually experiencing and therefore having better expertise about their own lives. Often as researchers, we go into communities with assumptions that we're experts who carry expertise on how to respond to social issues confronting people. And I believe that we need to be humble and acknowledge that people understand their lived realities better than us who come from the outside. And I will stop here. Thank you very much. And next slide, I think there's a last slide. Yes, Kialabuha. And yeah, these are just some of the women who I collaborate with in my work. And thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Prof. I think it's really important what you are saying about giving the community agency and voice when they're talking about their own personal experiences and not thinking that just because they are experiencing difficulties, they don't know what they're going through. So, yeah, very, very useful and thought-provoking information that you've shared with us. I don't see any questions, so maybe we can open up for the next 15 minutes the floor. If there are any questions, you can switch on your microphone and you may ask Prof what you would like to know more about. I think this is an open engagement. You don't need to feel judged in any way, so please feel welcome to ask someone that knows about decolonization and thinking through different ways of doing research. Ask some questions. Okay, it seems like people are quite quiet, but yes, and when you were talking, I couldn't help but think about my own childhood experience of playing in the road, and the types of games that we played, and doing needlework at school, and what this all meant. Because when you as a child, you don't think about what you are being groomed into doing later on in life by these activities. So I think that it was, I must say, I really enjoyed the presentation. Took lots of notes.
Okay. No, I'm glad. I think it's one of the things that I was hoping to highlight was for us to think about our communities where we grew up and the many the ways in which we understood the world. They always say, a child is very clever until they go to school, because often when you go to school, then you receive a different view or understanding of the world. And often there's usually this clash. You know, you go to school or you go to university, and when you go home, you start looking at your community very differently, because now you're using the lenses and the theories that you learned at the university to try and make sense of life within your own family, within your own community. And while to some extent that might be useful, I think there's a lot that we miss there as well. Because in that moment, we often assume that because we gain this knowledge within an academic institution, within a university, it is therefore superior to the kinds of knowledges that are there within our communities as well. And I think what that does is that it really robs us of the possibility to look at ways in which we can look at what is within our communities and look at the ways in which we can theorize what is happening in our communities, and have that as part of the learning process and as part of the ways in which we theorize social life within academia and within psychology in particular, if you think about the ways in which people relate to one another and people engage with one another. So if I can just make one quick example. So if you think about the issue of grief, for example, and the way that many communities engage with the process of grief. You know, we are taught within psychology, you know, many of us know about Kubler-Ross's process of grief, right? You know, you're in denial, you try to bargain, you're trying to make sense of what's going on, and you know, you get angry, and at the end you're like, okay, it is what it is, I'm going to accept, and then that's a healthy way, and then you can be able to move forward. So you're dealing with your grief. But that happens at a very individualistic level, because it's my grief, it's what I'm going through, it's me trying to make sense of what's going on. And you'll find that in many communities, or in many African communities, if I can make that example without at the expense of generalizing, is that you find that there are other ways in which people deal with grief, right? You'll find that grief is a very collective experience. When there's been a loss in the family, there is a collective experience to the grief, so that a person or the person who's mourning is not overwhelmed by the grief. So it becomes something that is not carried by any individual, but it becomes a very collective experience. That's why in some of our families, when there's been a loss in the family, immediately certain relatives move in, if I can call it that. They immediately move in. So there are certain aunts and uncles who would come through, you know, like in along we say the Rachati, Malome, Mangwaine, Mamohole, all the different aunts who have different responsibilities within the family. They are there to be part of the mourning, and as a result, it's almost as if it lessens the burden on somebody, where it allows them to be able to deal with the grief that they are experiencing. And this is one of the things that I think we're not paying enough attention to, especially now with the challenge of COVID-19 that we're experiencing, that with the way in which some of the rituals around funerals have had to change because of having to make sure that we save people's lives and minimize people who attend funerals, that there's many things also that have been affected in terms of the processes of grief, but also the rituals surrounding funerals. So as we think about moving forward and how we're going to imagine life beyond COVID, is that we also need to think about some of these unresolved issues that are going to be remaining within many families that would need to be resolved beyond COVID-19, in terms of how people now have to reconcile with some of the rituals that they did not get the opportunity to do. And if we had, or if we take enough time to theorize on some of these processes in our communities, it would help us later on, because it would be something that we have actually grappled with, that we have engaged with, that we have theorized, and that we have a better understanding of. And that is why I'm saying part of the decolonizing approach is that we need to take such things very seriously if we are to respond to issues that are relevant to us, issues that are within our context. So yeah.
Completely agree. But I like the point that you made about when you go to university, how you end up looking down upon what you already know, as opposed to celebrating what you know and where you come from,
Mhm.
and and seeing the power in the knowledge that is produced in your own community, as
Mhm.
opposed to valuing knowledge that is coming from outside.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I think one of the challenges is getting institutions to rethink how we do research with
Mm.
people in the community. Because as you mentioned, ethics, it's like a tick box. You must have anonymity, you must have confidentiality, you must lock things away. And and this becomes difficult because how do we then give agency and empowerment to the participants and the people that are co-creating knowledge with us? How
Mm.
do we actually do that when institutional structures they bar us from thinking differently about what it is that you are doing?
Mm.
So we're talking about decolonizing our profession and decolonizing psychology, but what about institutional practices that are not empowering to communities?
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely, definitely. I think these things cannot happen in isolation. We cannot speak about decolonizing psychology within an academic context when the institution itself is not transformed, is not decolonized. Because as the example that we gave, for you to do research, you need to comply to certain standard and certain processes and guidelines that have been set by the institution itself, and therefore it becomes a challenge for us to operate in silos in our little corners. But what we need to do is that there has to be a confrontation to the actual institutions themselves. The so-called institutional culture has to undergo a serious rethinking, because otherwise the change that happens will always be very cosmetic, and there'll always be challenges along the way, because the student will say, I want to do a work that really uses this method that needs me to do 1, 2, and 3. I want to do this kind of work, but then the ethics committee is rejecting my work, or my work is not being accepted by the higher degrees committee because they're saying, but that's not possible because it's not in line with 1, 2, 3. And therefore it's important, I think, for us to understand that decolonization cannot happen in little boxes, but it really requires a dismantling of our institutions and a serious rethinking in terms of how we produce knowledge and the tools that we use in doing so.
Definitely.
Mm.
Well, I've taken quite a lot away from this. Will I have access to slides in the recording? Yes, there will be access to slides in the recording. Prof. Willie from University of Fort Hare will um, organize it and put it on the DRM YouTube channel. So I'm not sure how long that will take, but we're hoping to put it out there. So it's 5 past 1. I'd like to say thank you so much for this engaging presentation, Prof. I wish more students could access this type of information, but I think by us putting it on YouTube and hopefully encouraging our students to engage in this type of thinking, maybe it could help. But like you say, we need to change institutional cultures to be more accommodating of new ways of finding knowledge. And I also
Mm.
like that you made such a valid point about bereavement and changing of bereavement practices and how that is going to affect the psychology of us all moving forward in the future.
Mhm.
So, thank you so much, Prof. Thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar today. We'll make
Thank
the
you.
presentation available.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Okay.